Picture this. You're walking through the most secure building in Britain, doing your regular rounds as a palace guard. You've done this walk 1,000 times before. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same routine. Nothing ever happens that isn't planned down to the minute. Then suddenly you hear something that makes your blood run cold. A child crying. But not just any child. This is a royal residence, and there's only one little boy who should be here right now. Prince Louis, the youngest son of the future King of England. Your heart starts racing. The cry is coming from somewhere it shouldn't. Somewhere no child should ever be. In 5 minutes, everything you thought you knew about palace security, about your job, about the safety of the royal family, is about to be turned upside down. This is the story that the palace tried to keep quiet. The story of how a routine security check became a race against time. The story of 5 minutes that could have changed the course of British history forever. For the first time, the guard who lived through those terrifying moments is ready to tell the truth about what really happened that day. What he found, what he did, and why the palace will never be the same again. James Morrison had been a palace guard for 12 years. Every morning at 6:30, he would put on his uniform, check his radio, and begin the same route he had walked over 4,000 times. The East Wing security check was supposed to be the easiest part of his day. Nothing ever happened in the East Wing. The morning of March 15th started like any other. James grabbed his coffee from the staff kitchen, nodded to the other guards coming off the night shift, and started his rounds. The palace was already buzzing with activity. Kitchen staff were preparing breakfast, housekeepers were moving quietly through the corridors, and somewhere in the private apartments, the royal family was starting their day. James liked the morning shift. The palace felt different in the early hours, calmer, more peaceful. The tourists hadn't arrived yet, and the official business of the day hadn't begun. It was just him, the ancient walls, and centuries of history surrounding him. He had always felt proud to work at the palace. Growing up in a small town outside London, James never imagined he would one day be trusted to protect the royal family. His father had been a police officer, his grandfather a soldier. Service was in his blood. When he got the job at the palace, his whole family had gathered to celebrate. The training had been intense. Months of background checks, psychological evaluations, and practical exercises. They taught him how to spot threats, how to react in emergencies, how to blend into the background while staying alert. Most importantly, they taught him the layout of the palace. Every room, every corridor, every possible escape route. The East Wing was considered low risk. It housed some of the palace offices, a few guest rooms that were rarely used, and storage areas. The royal family's private apartments were in the North Wing, far from James's usual route. Security was lighter in the East Wing, which is why James usually worked alone there. As he walked through the familiar corridors that morning, James was thinking about his daughter's upcoming birthday. She was turning 8, and she had been begging him to tell her stories about the palace. Of course, he couldn't share any real details about his work, but he loved to describe the beautiful rooms and the sense of history that filled every corner of the building. The first part of his route took him through the administrative offices. These rooms were empty at this hour, but James still checked each one carefully. He tested door handles, looked for anything out of place, and made notes on his clipboard. Everything was normal. Next came the guest wing. These were elegant rooms used for visiting dignitaries and special guests. The furniture was covered with white sheets, and the rooms had that slightly musty smell of spaces that weren't used often. James's footsteps echoed on the polished floors as he moved from room to room. It was in the third guest room that he first noticed something was different. The door, which should have been locked, was slightly open. James frowned and checked his notes. According to the schedule, no one should have been in this area since the previous week. He pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. The room looked normal. Bed made, curtains drawn, everything in its place. But there was something in the air, a sense that someone had been there recently. James couldn't put his finger on what it was exactly. Maybe the faint smell of soap, or the way the dust had been disturbed on the windowsill. James made a note to report the unlocked door to his supervisor. It was probably nothing. Maybe the cleaning staff had forgotten to lock up properly. But in his 12 years at the palace, he had learned that small details mattered. The security of the royal family depended on everyone doing their job perfectly every single day. He continued his route, checking the remaining guest rooms and the small storage areas at the end of the corridor. Everything else seemed normal. James was starting to relax when he reached the final part of his route, the old servant's staircase at the far end of the east wing. The staircase was narrow and steep, dating back to the original construction of the palace. It had once been used by servants to move between floors without being seen by the royal family and their guests. Now it was mainly used for storage and as an emergency exit route. James had walked up and down these stairs hundreds of times. He knew every step, every landing, every creaky board, which is why he immediately noticed the footprint in the dust on the 7th step. It was small, too small to belong to any of the staff members who might have reason to use the staircase. James knelt down and looked more closely. The print was fresh, and it looked like it had been made by a child's shoe. A chill ran down James's spine. Children weren't supposed to be in this part of the palace. The only children who lived in the palace were the royal children, and they stayed in the heavily guarded north wing. What was a child doing on the old servant's staircase? James stood up and listened carefully. The palace was never completely silent. There were always sounds of people moving about, doing their work. But this morning, something felt different. He couldn't hear the usual sounds from the kitchen below, or the murmur of voices from the offices. He started climbing the staircase, following the dusty footprints. They were definitely made by a small child, and they were heading upward, toward the upper floors of the east wing. James's heart began to beat faster. The upper floors of the east wing were supposed to be completely empty. At the top of the staircase was a long corridor lined with doors. These rooms hadn't been used for decades. They were part of the original palace structure, but they were too old and inconvenient for modern use. The doors were kept locked, and James had the only keys for this area. But as he reached the top of the stairs, James could hear something that made his blood freeze. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. James pulled out his radio but hesitated before calling for backup. He needed to understand what was happening before he raised an alarm. If he was wrong, if it was just his imagination or some innocent explanation, he could end up looking foolish. But if he was right, if there really was a child in danger somewhere in these abandoned rooms, every second counted. The crying was coming from somewhere down the corridor. James moved quietly toward the sound, his hand on his radio, ready to call for help at any moment. The corridor was dimly lit, with only a few small windows providing natural light. The dust on the floor showed the same small footprints he had seen on the staircase. As he got closer to the source of the crying, James began to recognize something about the voice. It sounded familiar, though he couldn't place where he had heard it before. The child was calling for someone, Mama, over and over again. James reached the door where the crying seemed to be coming from. He tried the handle, but it was locked. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking slightly. The crying was getting louder now, more desperate. Finally, he found the right key and turned the lock. The door swung open, and James stepped inside. What he saw in that room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sitting on the floor in the corner of the dusty, empty room was a small boy with blonde hair and tear-stained cheeks. The child was wearing pajamas, expensive-looking pajamas that James had seen before in newspaper photographs. It was Prince Louis, the youngest son of Prince William and Princess Catherine. And he was completely alone, crying for his mother in an abandoned room that was supposed to be locked and empty. James's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. How had the prince gotten here? Where were his bodyguards? Where was his nanny? How long had he been alone in this room? The little prince looked up at James with frightened eyes. "I can't find Mama," he said in a small voice. "I was playing hide and seek, but now I can't find anyone." James knelt down slowly, not wanting to frighten the child any further. His training had covered many emergency scenarios, but nothing had prepared him for finding a royal child lost and alone in a part of the palace where no child should ever be. "It's okay," James said gently. "I'm here to help. Let's go find your mama." But even as he spoke these comforting words, James's mind was spinning with terrifying possibilities. If Prince Louis was here, alone and unguarded, it meant that something had gone terribly wrong with the palace security. Someone had failed in their duty to protect the royal family, and in 5 minutes when James made the radio call that would bring the entire security team running, the palace would erupt into chaos. Questions would be asked, heads would roll, and the story of how a 3-year-old prince had wandered into one of the most dangerous parts of the palace would become a secret that the royal family would spend years trying to bury. But first, James had to get the little prince to safety. As he reached out to take the child's hand, he had no idea that these would be the 5 most important minutes of his entire career. James Morrison's hands were trembling as he picked up Prince Louis. The little boy wrapped his arms around James's neck and buried his face in his shoulder. James could feel the child's tears soaking through his uniform shirt. "It's going to be okay," James whispered, but his mind was racing with panic. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that he's in serious danger? How do you tell a frightened child that the very people who are supposed to protect him have somehow failed? James carried the prince out of the dusty room and into the corridor. He needed to get the boy back to the family quarters as quickly as possible. But first he had to figure out exactly what had happened. The palace security system was supposed to be foolproof. There were cameras everywhere, motion sensors, guards at every entrance. How had a small child managed to slip away unnoticed? As they walked down the corridor, Prince Louis began to talk. Between sniffles, he told James about his morning. He had woken up early and wanted to play. His nanny was busy getting his clothes ready, so he had decided to explore. He remembered playing hide-and-seek with his older brother George the week before, and he wanted to find an even better hiding place. "I found a secret door," Prince Louis said proudly, behind the big painting in the playroom. "I crawled through, and there were stairs. I thought it was like a castle adventure like in my storybooks." James's blood ran cold. The secret door behind the painting. He knew exactly what the child was talking about. There was an old servant's passage that connected the family quarters to the East Wing. It had been built centuries ago and was supposed to have been sealed up decades ago. Apparently, someone had missed it during the security renovations. The little prince had crawled through this passage, probably thinking he was on a grand adventure, not realizing he was putting himself in terrible danger. The East Wing wasn't just less secure than the family quarters. It was connected to several exit points that could have been accessed by anyone with bad intentions. James reached for his radio but hesitated again. Once he made this call, everything would change. The palace would go into lockdown mode. Every guard, every staff member, every security system would be activated. The press would get wind of the story eventually. The reputation of the palace security would be destroyed. But looking down at the innocent face of Prince Louis, James knew he had no choice. The safety of the royal family was more important than anyone's career, including his own. "Control, this is Morrison in the East Wing," he said into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need immediate assistance. I have Prince Louis with me. He's safe, but we have a security situation." The response was immediate and explosive. Within seconds, James's radio was crackling with urgent voices. Security Chief Anderson's voice cut through the chaos. "Morrison, confirm your location immediately. Do not move until backup arrives." "East Wing, Corridor 7, James replied. "The prince is unharmed, but he accessed this area through an unknown passage from the family quarters." James could hear running footsteps echoing through the palace corridors. Alarms were going off somewhere in the distance. He sat down on a dusty chair with Prince Louis on his lap, waiting for the cavalry to arrive. The little prince seemed fascinated by all the excitement. "Are we in trouble?" he asked innocently. "No, you're not in trouble," James said softly. "But we need to get you back to your mama and papa. They're probably very worried about you." What James didn't tell the child was that by now, the entire palace was in panic mode. Prince William and Princess Catherine would have been woken up immediately. The Queen's security team would have been notified. Emergency protocols that hadn't been used in decades were probably being activated. The first person to reach them was Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, the head of Royal Protection. She came running up the stairs, her face pale with worry and anger. Behind her were 6 other officers, all looking grim. "James, thank God," Detective Collins said, rushing over to them. "Prince Louis, are you hurt? Are you okay?" The little prince nodded and smiled at her. He didn't understand the seriousness of the situation. To him, this was all just an exciting adventure with lots of new people to meet. Detective Collins quickly examined the child while firing questions at James. "How long has he been missing? How did he get here? Have you secured the area? Has anyone else been in these rooms? James answered as best he could while the other officers spread out to search the surrounding rooms. One of them was already on his radio, reporting back to the command center that the prince had been found safe. We need to get him back to his parents immediately, Detective Collins said. James, I need you to show me exactly how he got here. We need to understand how this happened before we can make sure it never happens again. As they made their way back toward the family quarters, James led Detective Collins to the hidden passage behind the painting. The entrance was so small that only a young child could have crawled through it. The passage itself was narrow and dark, filled with dust and cobwebs. This passage isn't on any of our current security plans, Detective Collins said grimly. It should have been sealed decades ago. This is a massive security failure. Meanwhile, other officers were already working to secure the passage. James could hear them on their radios coordinating with maintenance teams to get the entrance sealed immediately. When they finally reached the family quarters, the scene was chaotic. Prince William was in the hallway, still in his pajamas, his face etched with worry. Princess Catherine was crying as she took her son from James's arms. Both parents looked like they had aged years in the past hour. "Louis, where have you been?" Princess Catherine said, holding her son tightly. "We've been looking everywhere for you." "I was playing hide-and-seek, Mama," Prince Louis said happily. "I found the best hiding place ever, and I made a new friend." He pointed at James, who was standing awkwardly to the side, still trying to process everything that had happened. Prince William walked over to James and shook his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found him." James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He had found the prince, yes, but he was also painfully aware that the security failure that had allowed this to happen was enormous. A 3-year-old child had been able to wander into one of the most dangerous parts of the palace, completely undetected. Detective Collins was already coordinating the investigation. "We need to interview everyone who was on duty this morning," she was saying into her radio. "I want a complete review of all security protocols, and I want that passage sealed within the hour." The family's nanny, Maria Santos, arrived looking distraught. She had been frantically searching the family quarters when she realized Prince Louis was missing. "I only left him alone for 5 minutes," she kept repeating. "I was just getting his clothes ready. He was playing quietly in the corner." James understood how she felt. 5 minutes was all it had taken for everything to go wrong. 5 minutes for a curious child to slip away and put himself in danger. 5 minutes that could have ended in tragedy. Over the next hour, the palace transformed into the scene of a major investigation. Security experts arrived from London. The building was swept from top to bottom. Every possible security weakness was identified and addressed. But even as all this activity swirled around him, James couldn't stop thinking about those terrifying moments when he had first heard Prince Louis crying in the empty room. What if the child had fallen down the stairs? What if someone with bad intentions had found him first? What if James had decided to skip that part of his rounds that morning? The questions haunted him, and he knew they would for a long time to come. Detective Collins pulled James aside as the immediate crisis was being handled. "James, I need you to understand something," she said seriously. "What happened here today can never become public knowledge. The security of the royal family depends on people believing that our protection is perfect. If word gets out that a 3-year-old managed to slip past all our safeguards," James nodded. He understood the implications. The story of Prince Louis's adventure would have to remain a secret, known only to the people who were there that day. But secrets have a way of eating at people from the inside. As James watched the investigators seal up the hidden passage, he wondered if he would ever be able to forget those 5 minutes that had shaken the palace to its core. The official report would say that a routine security check had revealed a previously unknown structural weakness. The passage would be described as a historical anomaly that had been overlooked during previous renovations. The fact that a royal child had been in danger would be buried so deep that even most palace staff would never know it had happened. James was commended for his thoroughness in discovering the security breach. He received a letter of appreciation from the Queen herself. But as he read the carefully worded praise, all he could think about was the sound of a frightened child crying alone in an empty room. The investigation would continue for weeks. New security measures would be put in place. Background checks would be intensified. Technology would be upgraded. But none of it would change the fact that for those terrifying minutes, the most protected children in Britain had been completely vulnerable. And James Morrison, the guard who had found Prince Louis, would carry the weight of that knowledge for the rest of his life. 3 weeks after finding Prince Louis in the abandoned room, James Morrison was called into Security Chief Anderson's office. The investigation into the security breach was officially complete, and James had been dreading this meeting. He knew that someone would have to take responsibility for what had happened, and he was afraid that person might be him. Chief Anderson was a tall, stern man who had been in charge of palace security for over 15 years. He had served in the military before joining the Royal Protection Team, and he ran the security operation like a military unit. Nothing escaped his attention, and mistakes were not tolerated. "Sit down, Morrison," Chief Anderson said without looking up from the file on his desk. James sat down and waited, his hands sweating despite the cool temperature in the office. "I've read your report about the incident 3 times, Chief Anderson continued. "I've also reviewed the statements from Detective Collins, the nanny, and the maintenance team who sealed the passage. Everyone agrees that you handled the situation professionally." James felt a small wave of relief, but he could tell there was more coming. "However," Chief Anderson said, finally looking up, "this incident has raised serious questions about our entire security system. The fact that a 3-year-old child was able to access a supposedly secure area of the palace is unacceptable. The royal family's safety was compromised, and that cannot happen again." James nodded. He had been having nightmares about what could have happened if the situation had been different. What if Prince Louis had been hurt? What if someone with bad intentions had found him first? The official investigation has concluded that this was a structural oversight from renovations done decades ago, Chief Anderson continued. The hidden passage was not on any current security plans because it was assumed to have been sealed. The maintenance records from the 1970s were incomplete, so no one knew it still existed. This was the official story, James realized. The palace was presenting this as a historical accident, not a current security failure. It was a way to explain what had happened without admitting that their modern security systems had failed. "But between you and me, Morrison," Chief Anderson said, leaning forward, "we both know this incident revealed much bigger problems. The family quarters security protocols were not followed properly. The nanny left the child unattended. The motion sensors in that corridor had been malfunctioning for weeks, and no one had reported it." He had expected to be given the official line and sent back to work with instructions to never speak of what had happened. "So what happens now?" James asked. "Several things," Chief Anderson replied. "First, the nanny, Maria Santos, is being quietly transferred to a different role. She won't be fired. That would raise too many questions, but she'll no longer be responsible for the direct care of the royal children. She was a kind woman who genuinely cared about the children. The fact that Prince Louis had managed to slip away during the few minutes she was preparing his clothes wasn't really her fault, but someone had to be held responsible. Second, we're implementing new security protocols throughout the palace. Every historical passage, every old tunnel, every forgotten door is being mapped and secured. We're also upgrading all our motion sensors and installing additional cameras in areas that were previously considered low risk." This made sense, James thought. The incident had shown that the palace's security had not kept up with the building's long and complex history. There were probably dozens of forgotten passages and hidden doors that weren't accounted for in the modern security plans. "Third," Chief Anderson continued, "we're changing the patrol schedules and routes. No guard will work alone in any area of the palace anymore. All patrols will be done in pairs, and there will be constant radio contact with the command center." This was probably a good change, although it would require hiring more guards and would be much more expensive than the current system. And finally, Chief Anderson said, his voice becoming very serious, "Everyone who was involved in this incident has signed additional confidentiality agreements. The story of what happened can never become public. The security of the royal family depends on maintaining the perception that our protection is absolute." James had already signed one confidentiality agreement when he was hired. This new one was even more restrictive. He was forbidden from discussing the incident with anyone. Not his family, not his friends, not even other palace employees who hadn't been directly involved. What if someone asks questions? James wanted to know. What if reporters start investigating? The official story is that routine maintenance discovered a previously unknown historical passage, which was immediately sealed, Chief Anderson replied. There was no security breach, no child in danger, no emergency response. As far as the public is concerned, nothing unusual happened that day. James understood the logic, but it still felt wrong to him. Prince Louis had been in real danger, and the people responsible for protecting him had failed. Shouldn't there be consequences? Shouldn't the public know that their security systems weren't as perfect as they claimed? But he also understood the bigger picture. If people lost faith in the palace's security, it could have serious consequences for the entire royal family. The threat from terrorists, kidnappers, and other dangerous people was real. The perception that the palace was impenetrable was part of what kept the royal family safe. Over the following months, James watched as the changes were implemented. New guards were hired and trained. The old passage where Prince Louis had crawled was not just sealed, but completely filled with concrete. Motion sensors were upgraded throughout the building. Additional cameras were installed in every corridor. But the most significant change was in the culture of the security team. The incident had shaken everyone's confidence. Guards who had been comfortable and relaxed in their routines were now constantly on edge. Every small sound, every unusual circumstance was treated as a potential emergency. James himself found it difficult to return to his normal routine. Every time he walked through the East Wing, he remembered finding Prince Louis crying in that dusty room. He started double-checking doors that he had always trusted to be locked. He found himself listening more carefully for any unusual sounds. The stress began to affect his home life as well. His wife noticed that he was having trouble sleeping and that he seemed distracted and worried. His daughter asked him why he wasn't telling her funny stories about the palace anymore. But James couldn't explain what was wrong without breaking his confidentiality agreement. 6 months after the incident, James was offered a promotion. He would become a senior guard with responsibility for training new recruits. The promotion came with a significant pay increase and better hours. Chief Anderson presented it as a reward for James's professionalism during the crisis. But James suspected there was another reason for the promotion. In his new role, he would have less contact with the royal family and would spend most of his time in the training facilities away from the main palace. It was a way of moving him away from the scene of the incident while still keeping him within the organization. James accepted the promotion, but he never stopped thinking about that morning in March. He trained hundreds of new guards over the following years, always emphasizing the importance of thorough security checks and constant vigilance, but he could never tell them the real reason why these things mattered so much. Sometimes he would see Prince Louis in the palace corridors, always surrounded by guards now, always under careful watch. The little prince would grow up never knowing how close he had come to serious danger that day. He would never know that his innocent adventure had changed the entire security system of the palace. The media never found out what had really happened. There were occasional rumors and speculation about security upgrades at the palace, but nothing specific. The official story of routine maintenance discovering a historical passage was accepted without question. But James knew that secrets have a way of surfacing eventually. Somewhere in the files of Detective Collins, in the statements of the guards who had responded that day, in the maintenance records of the sealed passage, was evidence of what had really happened. And someday, when enough time had passed and the people involved were no longer concerned about their careers, someone might decide to tell the truth. James often wondered what that truth would look like when it finally came out. Would people be shocked by the security failure? Would they lose faith in the palace's ability to protect the royal family? Or would they simply see it as proof that even the most carefully planned systems can be defeated by the innocent curiosity of a 3-year-old child? Whatever happened, James knew he would always carry the memory of those 5 minutes that had shaken the palace. 5 minutes when everything that was supposed to keep the royal family safe had failed. 5 minutes when a routine security check had become a desperate search for a missing prince. 5 minutes that had changed everything. Even though the world would never know it had happened, the truth was buried now, hidden behind official reports and confidentiality agreements. But truth has a way of surviving, even when powerful people want it to disappear. And James Morrison, the guard who had found Prince Louis crying alone in an abandoned room, knew that someday, somehow, the real story would finally be told. 25 years later, James Morrison was sitting in his garden enjoying his retirement when his phone rang. The caller identified herself as Sarah Jenkins, an investigative journalist from The Guardian. James's heart sank immediately. He had been dreading a call like this for years. "Mr. Morrison, I'm working on a story about palace security incidents from the 90s and early 2000s, Sarah said. I have some documents that suggest there was a significant incident involving Prince Louis when he was a young child. I was hoping you might be able to help me understand what really happened." James's mind raced. His confidentiality agreement was still in effect, even though he had retired from the palace 5 years earlier. But 25 years had passed since that terrifying morning when he had found Prince Louis crying in the abandoned room. Many of the people who had been involved were now dead or retired. The world had changed dramatically. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," James said carefully. "I was just a security guard. I wouldn't have been involved in anything significant." But Sarah Jenkins had clearly done her homework. "Mr. Morrison, I have copies of maintenance records from March 2001 that show a hidden passage in the East Wing was suddenly sealed with concrete. I have duty rosters that show you were on patrol in that area that morning. And I have medical records showing that Prince Louis was treated for minor cuts and bruises that same day." James felt his blood turn cold. Somehow, this journalist had pieced together fragments of information that had been buried for decades. The official cover-up that had seemed so complete at the time was beginning to unravel. "I also have a statement from Maria Santos," Sarah continued. "She's now 85 years old and living in Portugal. She recently gave an interview to a Portuguese newspaper about her time working for the royal family. She mentioned that she was transferred from her position as nanny after Prince Louis went missing for several hours one morning." James closed his eyes. Maria Santos had finally decided to speak. After 25 years of keeping the secret, she had told someone what really happened that day. And now, it was all going to come out. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to publish this story with or without your help," Sarah said. "But I want to make sure I get the facts right. Prince Louis was in real danger that day, wasn't he? And the palace covered it up to avoid damaging their reputation." James was quiet for a long moment. He thought about that scared little boy crying alone in the dusty room. He thought about the massive security failure that had endangered a child's life. He thought about 25 years of keeping a secret that ate away at him every single day. "If you're going to tell this story," James said finally, "then you need to understand what really happened. Not just the facts, but what it meant, what it did to all of us who were there that day." Sarah Jenkins was an experienced investigative journalist, but even she was shocked by the full story James told her. The complete failure of the security systems, the hidden passage that had been forgotten for decades, the terrifying realization that Prince Louis could have been seriously hurt or even killed, the massive cover-up that had followed. But James also told her about the human side of the story, how Maria Santos had blamed herself for years, even though the security failure wasn't really her fault, how the guards had lived with constant anxiety after realizing how easily their protection could fail, how the incident had changed the entire culture of palace security. The worst part, James told her, was knowing that we had failed in our most important duty. We were supposed to protect that family, especially the children. And for those 5 minutes, we had no idea where Prince Louis was or what was happening to him. He could have been anywhere. Anything could have happened to him. Sarah spent weeks verifying James's account. She interviewed retired palace staff, reviewed archived documents, and spoke with security experts who confirmed that the changes made to palace security in 2001 were much more extensive than had been publicly reported. She also tried to contact current palace officials for comment, but they declined to discuss what they called historical security matters. Detective Collins, who had led the investigation at the time, had died several years earlier. Chief Anderson was now suffering from dementia and couldn't be interviewed. The story that Sarah eventually published was carefully written to protect current security measures while revealing the truth about what had happened 25 years earlier. She focused on the systematic failures that had endangered Prince Louis, rather than the specific details that might compromise current protection methods. The reaction to the story was explosive. The palace initially tried to dismiss it as speculation based on incomplete information, but too many sources had confirmed the basic facts. Within days, other news organizations were investigating their own angles on the story. Prince Louis, now 28 years old and married with children of his own, was forced to address the story during a public appearance. "I have no memory of the incident described in these reports," he said diplomatically. "But I have complete confidence in the security measures that protect my family today." But privately, sources close to the royal family said that Prince Louis had been deeply shaken by learning how close he had come to serious harm as a child. He reportedly asked to see the sealed records of the incident and spent hours reviewing the investigation files. The political implications were significant as well. Questions were raised in Parliament about the cost and effectiveness of royal security. Opposition politicians demanded to know what other security incidents had been covered up over the years. James found himself at the center of a media storm he had never wanted. Reporters camped outside his house, trying to get additional details about the story. He received angry phone calls from former colleagues who accused him of betraying the royal family. But he also received messages of support from other retired palace staff who said they were glad the truth had finally come out. "I kept that secret for 25 years, James told one interviewer. "I thought I was protecting the royal family by staying quiet, but maybe I was just protecting the people who had failed to protect them properly." The incident also sparked a broader conversation about the balance between security and transparency in a democracy. Should the public have a right to know when the people they pay to protect the royal family make serious mistakes? Or is the illusion of perfect security more important than accountability? For James, the most important outcome was personal. The weight of the secret he had carried for 25 years was finally lifted. He no longer had to pretend that everything had been handled perfectly that morning. He could finally talk about the fear he had felt when he realized a child was in danger, and the relief when Prince Louis was safely returned to his parents. "People need to understand that security is never perfect," James said in his final interview about the incident. "It depends on human beings doing their jobs correctly every single day. And human beings make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from those mistakes and do better next time." The palace eventually acknowledged that historical security protocols had been updated following routine reviews in 2001. They never admitted that a royal child had been in danger, but they also stopped denying that significant changes had been made. New security measures were implemented once again, incorporating lessons learned from the renewed scrutiny of the incident. The royal family's protection was enhanced with modern technology that hadn't existed in 2001. But for James Morrison, the guard who had found Prince Louis crying in an abandoned room 25 years earlier, the most important thing was that the truth had finally been told. The secret that had haunted him for decades was finally out in the open. He often wondered if he had done the right thing by speaking to the journalist. Part of him still felt loyal to the royal family and guilty about revealing their vulnerability. But another part of him believed that accountability was more important than protecting powerful people from embarrassment. The 5 minutes that had shaken the palace were finally acknowledged by history. The cover-up that had hidden a dangerous security failure was finally exposed, and James Morrison, who had spent 25 years carrying the burden of that secret, was finally able to rest. But the questions raised by the incident remained. How many other security failures had been hidden from the public? How could democratic societies balance the need for security with the demand for accountability? And what happened to truth when powerful institutions decided it was too dangerous to reveal? These were questions that would outlive James Morrison and everyone else who had been there that morning in March 2001. The truth about those 5 minutes that shook the palace had finally come out. But the larger questions about power, secrecy, and accountability would continue to challenge every generation.